Good afternoon, St. Francis College students, faculty, administration, staff, community partners, and members of the general public. My name is Issa Khan, and I'm a junior majoring in political science here at St. Francis College. Welcome to the 2021 Thomas J. Volpe Lecture. I'm thrilled to welcome Representative Hakeem Jeffries as this year's special guest. I've had the privilege of serving with Representative Jeffries as an intern, and I'm particularly interested and excited to hear what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion between St. Francis College President Miguel Martinez-Saenz and him. The Thomas J. Volpe Lecture Series is funded through a generous gift from Thomas J. Volpe, Chairman Emeritus of St. Francis College, Board of Trustees, and a former Senior Vice President of Financial Operations for the Interpublic Group of Companies Incorporated. If any audience members have any questions for Representative Jeffries, please submit them using the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many as we can, time permitting at the end. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Thomas J. Volpe.
Welcome you all to this first unique session of our lecture series, which has been in place for over 25 years. Over that time, we've had a number of very important and prestigious speakers. Our first speaker was Caspar Weinberger, who was the former Secretary of Defense when he joined us in 1997. Since that time, it's been our intention to invite many world leaders involved both in governmental affairs, politics, entertainment, literature, and a whole range of entrepreneurs who have joined us year after year. These included Sonia Sotomayor, the Supreme Court Justice, Senator George Mitchell, President Lech Walesa from Poland, President Mary Robinson of Ireland, President Oscar Arias from Costa Rica. Over this time, these speakers have shared with our students a variety of subjects and enabling them to understand the implications of the world order. We're happy to continue this, and tonight we're very, very honored to have Congressman Hakeem Jeffries as our current speaker. I'd like to introduce President Miguel to introduce our congressman. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it. So I am looking forward to this conversation with Congressman Jeffries. A couple shout outs real quick. Wayne Williams is probably on the call, and as some know, and I know our congressman knows, he's a proud alum of St. Francis College and now a senior policy advisor with the Democratic Caucus. So I imagine he's on the call and he's going to try to keep me honest in terms of the line of questioning. But a couple thank yous also, Congressman. Really, the COVID relief was really important for colleges like St. Francis, and you and I have had an opportunity to talk about the work that we do here. And really, you know, it's champions like you that enable folks to understand the real work that's happening in St. Francis College. They understand that the independents serve an incredible role in community, and I know you respect the role that we've been playing in community. And again, that work is much appreciated. Likely going to ask you a little bit about something towards the end, which is on housing. I know something that's dear to you, and I'll share a couple things that we're doing here on that context. But you know, we like to present these series as a way of getting young people to understand what the options are. And you know, you have been they have referenced your quoting a Biggie a number of times, right? And if you don't know, you now know, right? And so there's a sense that we're trying to get some awareness for our students, right? One of the things that we don't recognize all the time, that people don't know what they don't know, right? And so our burden as educators is to really create conditions for them to see what the power is, what the opportunities are in front of them. As I like to tell young people, you have an opportunity to choose to live the life that you want to live. And so the question before them is, what life is that going to be, right? Is it going to simply be a life to earn a living? Although we all know we need to make a living, but are you going to make a life more broadly? And I like what it is you do. So before we start from the beginning, and I want to start with your childhood in Brooklyn, but before we get there, it was rumored that you know, you don't take a knife to a gunfight. And so the reference for you is known, right, from Jay-Z's Takeover, but it's referenced that, you know, rap plays an incredibly important role in your life, and music does. I tell young people all the time, evaluate your playlist. It's important to understand what the music does to you, how it impacts you. So that story I read about you putting takeover on because you were likely going into battle, right, is critical. Because you talk to us a little bit before we get to the beginning, the influence that music and rap more directly has on your life.
Well, thank you so much, President Miguel. Appreciate you and your leadership and the educational excellence with which you have brought to bear at the helm of a great institution that has played such an important role in the education of so many Brooklynites and others throughout the city as well as the nation. And it's always a blessing whenever I get a chance to be with you and the faculty, and certainly the great students of St. Francis College. And to Tom and everyone else, thank you for your wonderful support of this great institution. Growing up in Brooklyn, hip hop was sort of on the rise at the same time when I was coming of age. And so, along with other influences, in particular, the Black church, and subsequently my opportunity to go to law school and training as a lawyer, it certainly has played an incredibly significant role, just woven into the fabric of who many of us growing up in central Brooklyn during the mid to late 80s into the early 90s, sort of a golden age of hip hop initially with people like Run DMC and LL Cool J, KRS-One, Eric B. and Rakim. When I was in high school and then through my college years into early adulthood, Jay-Z, Nas, the Notorious B.I.G., Snoop, Dr. Dre, that's when all of them were coming onto the scene. We know 25 plus years later, they're all iconic and incredibly relevant 25 plus years later. Yeah. But so one can imagine when the role and impact that this new movement within hip hop had as they were translating to America what was happening in communities like Brooklyn, or parts of Southeast Queens or the Bronx, and certainly South Central Los Angeles, Compton and Watts, and in many ways all points in between as hip hop developed. And so it was central in that regard. And I continue to carry it with me. Last observation, President Miguel, I'll make on this, because in part, that's what the House of Representatives as an institution, as you know, is supposed to represent. The institution within the federal government construct designed to be the closest to the people. That's why the House has 2-year terms, not 4-year terms like the presidency, or 6-year terms like the Senate, or life tenure like the Supreme Court. 2-year terms, so that we can stay on the ground close to the people, come to Washington, reflect the hopes, the dreams, the aspirations, the concerns, the anxieties, and the passions of the people. Those were the words of the framers. And so while they perhaps could never have imagined someone from Brooklyn with the name Hakeem Jeffries ever serving in the House of Representatives, unimaginable, in 1787. However, they did imagine that people would take their upbringing, their connectivity to the communities they serve to Washington and their life experiences. And that's what I've endeavored to do. And hip hop has been an important part of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Look, I think this is interesting in terms of talking about our education, right? Because one of the things I tell faculty all the time, your students have a lot of knowledge, right? It's just they're consuming cultural artifacts that you might not be familiar with, right? And so you want them to consume other cultural artifacts, and there's an entry point, right? If you actually lend an ear, to use the phrase in terms of music, to what they're listening to. I tell people all the time, I listen to everything my daughter listens to, right? She's 15 years old. I want to get it all, right? I took her to a Drake concert and Migos opened up and I said, I don't want you to listen to Migos anymore. I was going to shut that one down, right? So it's this sense. So I appreciate that you bring that. And as you put it in context, given the House of Representatives, right? Be in touch with the people. So critically important. Let's do something. Let's just start so people get a sense. And I want to emphasize the importance of humanizing folks that have chosen a life in public service. Because sometimes, right, you know it, right? We're demonizing people all the time in the media. That's what we see, a bunch of sound bites, right? Somebody's hating on you, somebody's hating on somebody else. But really what I'm trying to get young people to see is, look, these are human beings. They got struggles just like everyone. They're cracked vessels just like us. And they're trying to be of service to us. So let's start from the beginning so we can humanize this experience. I mean, can you give us some detail growing up? Get us all the way through Midwood High. We've invited Midwood High to be here. I don't know how many we've got on the call, but give us a little sense of what was it to be the child, right, in Brooklyn? What was it to be that?
Well, you know, Brooklyn, I think it's fair to say, was a lot grittier than it is right now, a lot edgier than it is right now. I mean, those were the days, you know, sort of leather jackets and Timberland boots, baseball caps, baggy clothing, you know, not sidewalk cafes and bike lanes, right? There were not a lot of sidewalk cafes and bike lanes growing up, and spending a lot of time in Crown Heights and Bedford-Stuyvesant and East New York and large parts of Brooklyn at that time. But, you know, I remember even as a young person, you know, dealing with a lot of the drama that was just naturally around us, particularly as crack cocaine exploded on the scene and the levels of violence sort of increased dramatically in the mid to late 80s, at the same time when people from my era were going to high school, that if we could sort of make it through this kind of drama, danger almost at every corner in many of our neighborhoods, that would make us more resilient, almost consistent with both what Frank Sinatra once said and Jay-Z then echoed: if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. That was sort of our thinking. Yeah, this is kind of rough in terms of the ever-present nature of danger, even if you weren't in the drug life, because it was just around you.
Yeah.
But that level of resilience, I think, is something that we took pride in, and is something that I look back on today fondly, because I think it sort of toughens everybody up to make it through life. As you indicated, everybody's a cracked vessel, and life, you know, is not just wine and roses. You are going to encounter adversity, trials, tribulations. There are peaks and valleys. And I think the resiliency of Brooklynites, certainly at that time, but I would argue continuing in many ways through many neighborhoods today, is something that you can rely upon to make it through the journey and the obstacles that you continue to confront in adulthood.
Yeah. So, you know, in terms of, I mean, I think, and I'm not recalling it now, you know, you were just getting me to recall Tupac's piece on the rose that grew through concrete, right? That kind of fame, kind of really wise. Sometimes we don't really pay attention to the wisdom in some of these ways, right? I always tell people, I love this expression. I don't know if you heard it, right? I'm going to learn you something. And I love this expression. A lot of people say, well, that's ignorant. And I said, no, it's not. It's actually really deeply profound, because what they know and what they're communicating to you is they can't teach you anything. You got to learn it for yourself, right? There's this kind of profound moment. And I appreciate you said I was on a call today with some admission counselors and just talking about the college. And I said something about gritty, but to your point, right? The grittiness of Brooklyn is not the grittiness of what it once was. So really important. Midwood High, how were you as a student? I mean, just familiarize yourself. Were you a good student? Were you an interested student? I mean, one of the things we see, I go into about a high school a week across the city, mainly in Brooklyn. I go in to see young people, and some of them seem disaffected. And I say, so what? That's how I was when I was a high school student. Let's not romanticize us when we were 16 and 17, right? We have a burden to go up there and uplift them and get them excited about what's possible. What were you like as a high school student?
Yeah, I had a great experience at Midwood and made a lot of life long friends at that particular point in time. I was probably about a B+ student, few A's and A minuses here and there. I guess we probably had a 90 type of average system as I recall. But you know, I was probably somewhere around 87, 88, 89, sometimes crossed over in a given semester into the 90+ range. But I think what was most important to me during that time, you know, really were the friends that I made and the experiences that I had as part of a high school, believe it or not, that was 4,000 plus people, and the size of many colleges.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was incredibly diverse. You had the Medical Science Institute, which I was a part of, the Humanities Institute, and then I think there was Arts and Sciences, and then there was collegiate. Now, the collegiate part of the high school was sort of, you could zone in. And then the medical science part of the high school and humanities, you had to interview and grade in. So I had an opportunity to go there. It was a choice between Tech and Midwood High School. Interestingly enough, at the time, you think about the neighborhood that Brooklyn Tech is in right now, part of the reason that I turned down Brooklyn Tech, not the entire reason, is because my parents were of the view, that's a rough neighborhood. Wait, Fort Greene, Clinton Hills, a rough neighborhood?
Right.
But during those times, it was kind of rough. There was a gang called the Decepticons. They were all over the place. And, you know, other reasons why I chose to go to Midwood, but it was a much further commute for me. And because I was going south from Crown Heights, as opposed to simply downtown Brooklyn or Fort Greene, Nevin Street, or Atlantic Avenue would have been what I would have gotten off on. But, you know, Midwood, I look back on fondly. You know, I played baseball for a few years, had friends who were on the football team, basketball team, but we weren't, I mean, we knew everybody, the group that I hung out with, but we weren't like the super cool kids. And I tell people all the time, in terms of that, but we knew everybody. And there were different levels of athletes. We weren't superstar athletes. So I don't think we were at the top of the elite rankings list. But we knew everybody and we were cool with almost everybody. And I say to folks often, don't peak too early, right? Just continue to grow and develop and learn from the journey. But don't be consumed at a young age with instant fame. Because the last thing you can do as a young person, the worst thing you can do is peak too early. And now you're sitting around in your 40s or 50s or 60s saying to yourself on the couch, I was the man in high school. That cannot be your best memory, right? You peak too early. Yeah. So just don't be consumed with instant gratification and being part of the cool kids crowd, whatever that may be in today's iteration. Make your friends, get to know everybody, but put your work in and continue the journey. And that's, I think, what a lot of us, the group that I spent a lot of time with in high school did. And people have met with, you know, pretty good success down the road.
You know, I mean, I appreciate that from an educational point of view. It's interesting because I was just reading a book on this issue of education and development. And one of the arguments really is we, you know, especially now with parents, right? They get the kid, they want to get the kid at 2 years old in the right childcare, because if they don't get the right childcare, they won't do this and they won't do that. And really what's happened is a misnomer, right? That really, that's not the trajectory for a lot of people that have just blown up, right? And one of the stories they talk about is Federer, that he didn't even want to play tennis, right? And he took to tennis very late. So it wasn't like he wanted to be a famous tennis player all along, right? His parents didn't put a racket in his hand. In fact, it's interesting, his mom was a tennis coach, so they didn't want him to play tennis. And then he becomes arguably one of the best tennis players, if not the best tennis player in the history, right? So I love the way you say it, don't peak too early, right? And don't think that if you haven't got it figured out, you know, you something's wrong, right? At 17, 18, I tell young people all the time, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with my life, right? And they look at me suspiciously, but it's true. Talk to us a little bit about your choice. Importance of education, I know from what I've read about you, right? Your parents were committed to education. And I believe is your brother still at OSU?
Yeah, my brother's still at Ohio State, and he went to Morehouse College down in Atlanta, where he got his bachelor's degree, and then he got his Ph.D. In history at Duke, and now he teaches within the history department at Ohio State, along with you know, his wife and my three nieces. He's got three 3 girls. And so he's enjoying it. But I think his journey toward getting a PhD, and I wound up pursuing a master's degree in public policy after graduating from State University of New York at Binghamton, and then came back home to NYU to study law, and went off to practice law for a few years before getting into public service. I think a lot of that does trace back to my grandmother. My grandmother had an associate's degree. She was a nurse, spent a lot of time at Maimonides, as I recall, when we were growing up, sometimes would take us there. But she would always talk to my younger brother, he's 2 years younger than me, and myself about the importance of education, which I think, in immigrant communities, in communities of color, the type of communities that St. Francis has so capably served over the years, that educational ethic, I think, is something that people probably can relate to. And my grandmother was so locked in on it that every time we graduated from elementary school, high school, college, graduate school, because she basically said, you and your brother are going to graduate from elementary school, then you're going to graduate from high school, then you're going to graduate from college, then you're going to go get an advanced degree, a law degree, or a PhD, or a master's degree, whatever the case may be. And I said to my grandmother, Grandma, we're going to be in school our whole lives. But in fact, she was so committed to it that every time we graduated, going back to elementary school, she would give my brother and I, upon graduation, $500 cash. Now, I made the mistake of sharing this story in front of my 2 boys.
Yeah.
Dad, you've been shortchanging us our entire lives. I don't even know where my grandmother got that kind of money, but she was committed to incentivizing the educational journey. And I think that was, probably an experience not unlike what many of your students have met with as they've traveled their journeys to the college.
Well, emphasizing that, I mean, really the positive reinforcement, right? I was telling some folks recently, I mean, we go into all sorts of high schools and we do immediate decision days. And, some of those students can't afford to come. I mean, we're a very reasonably priced private, but still, right? And there's no discretionary income. There's no discretionary income. But really, going in, you see that move to allow them to get accepted to college. We know in those communities, they go home and say, I got accepted to college. Right, that just changes the dynamic. All of a sudden, they're able to push in a direction. Talk to me a little bit about the church, right? I mean, there's a lot there. There's been some written about you that's really where you get your influence as a speaker. Talk to us a little bit about that. Your influence at Cornerstone Baptist. How that influenced your life. How it continues to inform your approach to loving and serving the community.
Well, definitely growing up in the Cornerstone Baptist Church in Bedford-Stuyvesant was, incredibly influential in ways that for me were seen as I was growing up, but then also unseen. And I kind of look back upon and realize it was also interesting because the church, Cornerstone, is on Madison and Lewis. And then 1 block away was the brownstone that my grandmother purchased for like $39,000. A long time ago. It's no longer within the family, but $39,000 that we also grew up in. I mean, it's probably, this is a multi-million-dollar block probably right now in Stuyvesant on Putnam and Lewis. But and it was great because after church, we would always go over to my grandmother's house on Sunday, and then we'd have a family meal. And that was probably where my grandmother would impart a lot of wisdom, but that was the family gathering place, for Easter and for Christmas holidays and Thanksgiving and Mother's Day. Father's Day, for whatever reason, that tends to get off the list of family gatherings. I mean, you take the father out, but those other four occasions was a big feast. And so I think, but growing up in the church, in so many different ways. One, the church puts you in front of the congregation in the cradle roll department. That's the youngest Sunday school division. And you're like 2 or 3 years old. And ask you to memorize a part, usually connected to an Easter play, Mother's Day play, Christmas. And then you say it in front of the congregation. And there's always an affirmative, warm, supportive reaction, however you deliver it. Yeah. But it starts at that age. And then, grows in sophistication in terms of what you're expected to memorize and then articulate as you get older. But it really begins very early. And I think in part, and my mother it was never a thing where she was, no, you were going to memorize your part. You were not going to have a piece of paper in front of you. And so I think to this very day, I'm very reluctant to have a piece of paper in front of me whenever I speak. Yeah. And in part because I think one of the things my mom was teaching us is that to connect with those who you're speaking with, leaves a more powerful impression in delivering what you are saying, as opposed to looking down and reading something from a paper, even if it's a heartfelt sentiment. So it's a lot easier to communicate the authenticity and power of the message. And that's probably something that I started at the age of 2. Yeah. And then I also, along with everybody else who grew up in the Cornerstone Baptist Church, the Concord Baptist Church, the Bethany Baptist Church, and so many other institutions in the borough of churches in Brooklyn. And the other thing I'd say lastly is that I often, hearing powerful sermons, and the Reverend Dr. Sandy Ray was the pastor at the time, and Cornerstone at the time was a mega church. Thousands of people, would attend the service. I remember it being difficult to find a seat as a young person, and they had an overflow room in the church because you couldn't get a seat in the sanctuary, and there are 2,000 seats or so in the sanctuary. I mean, it's an extraordinary kind of thing. And that was the case at other Black churches, particularly in Bedford-Stuyvesant at the time as well. But the pastor and other guest preachers who would come, I just remember always being impressed by those who could deliver a 25 or 30-minute sermon with no notes. The only thing in front of them was the Bible. That's it. To read the opening scripture and then maybe make reference to it as they were delivering the sermon. And I think that also has been something that I've carried with me from my upbringing in the church.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. It's funny, I can't do scripts. So one of my appointments here, they figured out they weren't going to deal with me, but I just said, I don't do scripts. And they said, no, we do. Yeah, I said, I don't do scripts. But I mean, look, I think you said something, and this is what I think is so powerful. Back to the House of Representatives, you're of the people. The people want to know you're of the people, right? When you're scripted, it doesn't feel like you're of the people, right? It feels contrived. And you know what you're about, you know what your commitments are, and you let it flow. Yeah, we make some mistakes because it's not scripted, but that really, allows folks to get a sense of who you are, if it's real. I love that. I've told people, and sometimes people take it literally. I said, I was a Baptist preacher in my previous life. And they go, oh, really? I said, no, I wasn't a Baptist preacher in my previous life. But sometimes I say, I tell you, I'm going to take my seat 3 times, right? So the first time, don't pretend I'm going to take my seat. The second one, start getting worked up. The third one, I'm probably going down, but it's not going to be on the first one. So that's kind of a play there. I read something.
And Mr. President, if I could just add something on that point, because that analysis that you laid out did trigger something also in my experiences in terms of not being afraid to make a mistake right? Because I think when you're on a script, in part, you're wedded to that script because you feel like, you know, if it goes in a different direction that you didn't anticipate, that's a mistake. No, it's not a mistake necessarily. It's how you recover from what you may have articulated awkwardly or think you may have articulated awkwardly, but you caught yourself before it came out.
Right.
That's most important. And, you know, I learned that from, you know, growing up, and I went to college, and then I pledged Kappa Alpha Psi as one of the, you know, one of the so-called Divine Nine historically Black fraternities.
Yeah.
And step shows, which you're familiar with, were very central when I was in college. And we would all come back home from wherever we were going to school, most of us upstate or those who were in the city, some from Black colleges or other parts of the country, come back home. And then you would have these big step shows. There usually be 3. And so like you build up to like, can I make the New York City step team, right, for Kappa Alpha Psi? So after my junior year, somehow I made the New York City step team. And Kappas, we step with canes, right, which can be very complicated because you have to both, you know, you're stepping, dancing, but you're using a cane, you're tossing the cane all over the place. And we would be held to the standard of the show was successful as a Kappa if you minimize the number of times the canes were dropped. If you got through a whole step show with no drops, it was like amazing. So we had this step show and, you know, we're kind of doing our thing. Canes are flying all over the place. A cane was tossed in my direction, a little bit of an errant toss, but I wasn't able to catch it and it dropped. I was on the back line at the time, but I reacted to the drop, reacted to it. And notwithstanding the fact that I picked it up quickly and got back into rhythm. At the end of the show, he wasn't an OG at the time, but he was one of the best Kappa steppers ever. But, you know, he was in his young 20s at the time and was no longer on the step team. He said, you did a really good job, but you made one mistake. I said, the drop. No, he said, no, the drop wasn't the mistake. That throw was errant. He said, the reaction was the mistake. Because almost no one would have caught the fact that you dropped it until you reacted. Yeah. And when you reacted, everyone knew that something just bad happened. Yeah. Had you not reacted because you got back into rhythm so quickly, it would have all been seamless. And I've never forgotten that. And, you know, you just power through. That was the lesson. And I think when you're speaking extemporaneously, power through. Nobody knows other than yourself what you were planning on saying. Yeah. If you take an exit prematurely, nobody knows. Just get back on the road.
Yeah, I love that because, you know, I've taught in correctional facilities for some time. And one of the things we always do, I always try to do if I'm doing a long project, 10 weeks or more with a group of, I usually work with men. We do, you know, we have them, they can recite poetry. They can do whatever they want, similar to access your tradition, right? No, you got to memorize it. But I always say I come in and I'm dropping rhymes and I'll do something and I'll make mistakes, but they don't know, right? I said, did I do that right? Yeah. I go, no, I didn't. Here's the text. And they're like, oh, it sounded good. I go, right, you got to keep the train going, right? Nobody really knows. It's how you keep the train going. So I love that piece. Let me ask a couple real quick questions. I don't know how quick this first one is, but I read somewhere that the LA riots, 92, for the young people, the 92 riots, maybe you could put it in context for the young people, especially that won't have context for it, were influential in your decision to begin that move to not only law school, but really to think about public service. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was definitely a influential moment in terms of me taking a further step toward a career in dealing with issues like racial and social justice. And it's interesting because we just observed about a week and a half ago, the 30-year anniversary of the Rodney King beating, where of course you had an African-American motorist who was pulled aside by the LAPD and brutally beaten with nightsticks, kicked, punched, multiple fractures, substantial injuries that he suffered, all without justification. But the irony of that particular moment is that there happened to be somebody, I'm dating myself now, who had a camcorder who recorded it. Because during those days, pre-cell phone, the footage of police violence, police brutality was largely not caught in a way that allowed the voices of those communities that were being brutalized to be believed.
Yeah.
And so the thinking at that particular point in time with respect to the LA Rodney King beating was that we're finally going to get justice. They cannot deny that this is something that's happened. That's not to say that the overwhelming majority of police officers aren't in the community to protect and serve. Those that I interact with in Brooklyn are hardworking public servants, and I've got great relationships with many of them. But we also have a police brutality, police violence problem. And that was captured in such a vivid way by a motorist with a camcorder, similar to what has just happened with George Floyd. But back then, you never saw the tape.
Right.
And so the thinking was, we're going to get justice. Then the trial happens. They move it from LA, diverse community, Black, Latino, white, to Simi Valley, which is like Copland, an almost all white jury somehow acquits the 4 white officers who were charged with brutally beating Rodney King. That's what leads to the LA uprising. So all of this is unfolding in the spring of my senior year. I come home, I turn on the TV, and I'm like, why is LA in flames? Right? I just remember that image. It's probably like a 13-inch TV, may have had some color. Why is LA in flames?
Yeah.
Oh, they acquitted the officers who we saw beat Rodney King like a piñata without justification. That's insane. And then, of course, LA burst into flames as part of the uprising that took place. And it was kind of that moment and the reaction that many of us had on the college campus and throughout the country. Like, no, we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. If everyone can see the same thing we all saw, no justice. And so that moment played a meaningful role for me in the same way, perhaps, that, you know, that image of George Floyd having the life suffocated out of him, crying out for his mother, you know, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds is probably going to impact a whole generation of folks, many of whom will go on to do tremendous things and already have influenced the public debate in such a meaningful way.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Look, I want to, as we get ready to transition, we got some students that have questions, but I just want to ask you one question. I mean, there's so much here we could talk about criminal justice reform. I tell young people, this is the human rights issue of your generation. Really, you've got to pay attention. I want to just have you touch. I just read an op-ed that you had written on housing, and actually you framed. So I just want you to talk a little bit about that housing. You frame it in that piece as a human rights issue, right? That this is what we're talking about when we're talking about housing. And I think I want to remember the number was, we probably need, what, 7 million homes to really deal with the crisis. The size of the epidemic in the United States is that, the magnitude is that serious. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Let me just frame this to you, because I'm going to tell you, I was surprised by young people. It's one of the great things working in college. You're always in touch with young people. So we had one of our vice presidents, Reza Fakhari. He's our VP for internationalization. He's the chair of Amnesty International USA. He asked if we wanted to launch an a human rights program. So, you know, he worked with our VP for academic, Dr. Jennifer Lancaster. They found a group of faculty, history, political science. And I said, yeah, do it. But, you know, our students they're not that in tune, right? So I thought, do it. Let's get it done. The faculty get excited. They're going to do a course, right? And they're going to do their foundations course, going to start in January. They're hoping for 20 students in a seminar. Over 70 students registered for the seminar. I had to divide it in two. We now have an Amnesty International chapter on the campus, where now those students are collaborating with the Amnesty chapter in Brooklyn. They've just started an Amnesty series, a human rights series. So, I mean, it's incredible. I think, you know, that's the thing I tell young people. I'm living through you, right? I'm going to be hopeful because of you, right? Talk to me just a little bit as we transition about housing as a human rights issue as we move to and get the students to ask you some questions.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for making that observation. I mean, I think that the great challenge for New York City's future, particularly for working class neighborhoods and for young people, for artists, all of whom are so integral into the vibrancy of the borough and the city, is the affordable housing crisis, which is suffocating, us and whole neighborhoods out of existence, in part as it relates to the intensity of the gentrification and displacement. And so, I mean, as I mentioned, my grandmother purchased a 4-story brownstone on a block in Bedford-Stuyvesant for $39,000 4 or so decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
That same block, you can't find a home going for less than $1 million.
Yeah.
And so how can working class folks experience the dream of home ownership that is so integral into the ability to achieve sort of a middle class lifestyle, which is the aspiration that we should have for every single American, if not beyond.
Yeah.
And then pass along that wealth creation to the next generation, which is what home ownership has so effectively done. And that's been a part of how you transfer intergenerational wealth. But if you cannot purchase a home at this particular point in time, how do you experience that? And so I think for New York City, we've been ahead of the curve in the challenge, but now we're seeing other parts of the country deal with intense housing displacement and gentrification as well. So in some ways, the magnitude of the challenge has at least given us an opportunity in Washington to now do something about it. Yes, we want to create and preserve affordable rentals. And one of the issues that we have as a big challenge in New York City is that 75% of the people rent, 25% of the people own in the city. It's the inverse of what is the case in almost every other part of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we have to hold what we have in terms of affordable rentals, but create the space in these outer borough neighborhoods in particular that were once very affordable to maintain the ability for people in neighborhoods like a Brownsville or in East New York or the West End of Coney Island or Canarsie to continue to be able to purchase a home and raise their families. And so it's going to take intentional engagement and investment at the federal level.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I believe President Biden and Vice President Harris are committed to this project.
Good, good. I appreciate that. So I want to bring on Professor Scott Hofer. He's going to introduce. We have 3 students. They're going to close us out with some questions for you.
Okay, so first off, thank you, President Miguel, and thank you, Representative Jeffries, for being here. So currently, freshmen in our honors program are studying themes of power and leadership. And so I'm happy that you're here because you embody those themes. And they're happy that you're here so they don't have to watch me. And as you guys have already talked so much about the great students here, I want to give a little plug for our political science students. So as they know, I'm sure, and you definitely know, you're chair of the House Democrats. It's a difficult job. It's a difficult, just caucus to deal with, especially when you have a slim majority. And so I guess we look forward to connecting you with our kind of St. Francis political community and with our growing network of connections. We've got students who are political consultants, media specialists, campaign managers even, and all sorts of positions and parties and local government. So I guess now I'm going to introduce some of them. So without further ado, Iram Aguas Vivas is a member of the honors program and part of the Engine team. Iram, I'll let you take it away from here.
Hi. Good afternoon, Representative Jeffries. Good afternoon, President Miguel Martinez. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Iram Aguas Vivas. I'm a proud freshman here at St. Francis College, and I'm majoring in psychology. I'm a member of the Engine team, which is a nonprofit organization that helps Ukrainian students with their English skills. Almost 3 years ago, I arrived to the United States from the Dominican Republic. to look for better opportunities, and to make my dream of graduating from college a reality. It surprised me how difficult it is for students to attend institutes of higher education. Like yourself, I'm aware of the essential role of education to avoid falling behind in a society that is continuously improving and changing. Therefore, I would like to ask you, what are your plans to improve access to quality education for all? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that question, and an incredibly important one. I mean, I think the ability to achieve the American dream in many ways is linked to the ability to pursue as an option higher education. It doesn't mean it's the only option because there are a lot of opportunities traditionally in the blue collar space, the building trades, construction, working at a manufacturing plant that were meaningful in terms of a middle class lifestyle. And now in the innovation economy, that may be the 21st century equivalent of that. But the ability to go and get a bachelor's degree, to be part of an intellectual community, to learn critical thinking, as you all are doing at St. Francis College, and then to get some expertise in a particular area to launch a career is so significant. So one, tackling the problem of debt is going to be important. I think the president has committed to eliminating at least $10,000 in student debt for every single student across the country. And I think that's a good start. That's a good threshold. There's legislation to go further than that. And I think we'll be having that discussion. Increasing access to grants, Pell Grants, for instance, and stepping up the bolstering of that program as an example, so that people aren't as reliant on loans is another thing that I think is particularly important to do. And there's a lot of support for that in the Congress. And we were able to, even with the previous administration, make some meaningful changes to Pell Grants that are beneficial to students like those at St. Francis College. And then I think making sure that we connect industry with the skills that you are learning as students is going to be particularly important, so that there's a greater degree of connection between when you graduate and the jobs that you'll have access to. Now, I'm partial to political science because I was a political science major, and it's a great major. But I think as many institutions of higher learning are doing, developing closer relationships with business and industry, so that upon graduation, the job market is there for our students to land, matching up with the skills that industry says it needs at a given moment in time. I think will also be important, and something that we want to lean into in Washington.
Always a good plug for the political science major. Let's see. Next question. Hakeem Jeffries is a student ambassador, campaign intern, and he's a member of the Pre-Law Society that we have on campus here. So I'm going to let Hakeem take it from here.
Hi, good afternoon, Representative and everyone. My name is Chiron, and I'm a sophomore at SFC studying political science. I really like that you touched on that story that you gave in your time at school, where you remember that it's not really the mistake, but the way you handle it. I think that's something I'd probably take with me from this. I think you touched on the question that I'm about to ask you, but something that I was wondering is, the political opportunities that you had when you just started were different from the ones available today, especially for politicians of color. What were some of the challenges you faced being Black while trying to climb the political ladder?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, to your point about it's not the mistake, it's how you handle the mistake. I think Winston Churchill, who, you and others may be, studying or have studied at different points in time, the one of the great statespersons of the 20th century, once said, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. All that matters is the courage to continue." And one of the things that I learned early as a candidate is that, the courage to continue was particularly important because I didn't meet with early success. I ran twice for the state assembly against a pretty powerful incumbent who was backed by the Brooklyn Democratic machine, had the support of the Albany political establishment. I was just, a young lawyer who grew up in the neighborhood at the time, ran twice for the assembly, lost twice. And I had to realize that, a knockdown is different than a knockout. That's the Hakeem Jeffries remixed version of Winston Churchill. A knockdown is different than a knockout. Yes, you're going to get knocked down because, as President Miguel indicated, everybody gets knocked down. That's the reality. You can look at people who've achieved high levels of success in almost any field of human endeavor, certainly in politics. Joe Biden ran for president 3 times before he was successful this final time. And, putting aside, we're going to jump from 46 back to 42, 43, and 44. I'm jumping over 45 because, we don't even have time to deal with him. But the 3 presidents prior to the one who just left office, they all lost their first congressional race. Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama. These are people who were viewed as rising stars. Certainly in the case of Barack Obama, young Bill Clinton, all the talent and ability and intellect in the world. George Bush's father was a congressperson from Texas, and they all lost their first congressional race. In fact, Barack Obama lost his first congressional race, I think, by 25 points. 25 points. He got knocked down on the ground, but he picked himself up, learned from the experience, powered through, got back in it, and not only did he run for Congress, he ran for a seat in the Senate, won it, and the rest is history. And so I think the most important thing as an African-American, but I think generally, is that your talent, your ability, yes, those are all important. And once you get there, once you arrive, once you win, that will help your trajectory in terms of being effective on behalf of the people that you represent. But the most important quality early on is resilience. That ability to I guess the Timex, I don't know, I'm dating myself again, but take a licking and keep on ticking. That was a commercial when I remember growing up. It takes a licking and keeps on ticking. Mm-hmm. And so I think that ability to do that, which we growing up in communities of color, immigrant communities, low income communities, that's what we do, right? I mean, this is part of what the life in Brooklyn prepares you for in many ways. But that's so critical. And then the only other thing I'd add is, make sure, identify the issues that you're most passionate about, and then pour into those issues in terms of your advocacy, because that's where your advocacy, your communication, what you share will be most authentic. And then people pick up on that, and it will connect you to those that you may one day hope to represent.
Okay, let's see. So for our final student question here, we have Miriam Schwabe. She's a member of the honors program as well, and she's also a leader of our student government. She's a senator for the St. Francis College student government. So I'll let Miriam take it from here.
Hello, Representative Jeffries. It is such an honor and privilege to be speaking to you currently, and listening to your stories was really enlightening. And given your political experience and being one of the top 5 Democrats in the entire House of Representatives, and the amount of time that you've spent representing people like us at the House of Representatives, do you believe that now is the time for politics to be redefined? And if so, can you please elaborate?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's always good to speak to a senator. I do have to admit that normally when some of our friends leave the House and they go to the Senate, we say that's a demotion, not a promotion. The senators think it's different, but it's great to be in your presence as a student senator. And thank you for that question. I mean, I think in the midst of a pandemic, a public health crisis, an economic crisis, we're dealing with a racial justice crisis. This past Saturday was the 1-year anniversary of Breonna Taylor being murdered. George Floyd's killer is on trial right now for that murder. We're dealing with systemic racism, dealing with, who are we going to be as Americans? Are we going to stay true to the concept of a nation of immigrants, welcoming all people, religious tolerance and diversity, or are we going to walk away from that? And then, of course, a violent insurrection and attack on the Capitol, striking at the very heart of, are we going to be committed to this democracy thing? In a moment where we're dealing with any one of those issues would have been extraordinary. We're dealing with all of them at the same time. And then, of course, a climate crisis that threatens the existential, realities that we confront in terms of the existence of the planet. I think now's the time for bold transformational action. It has to be, bold and transformational in how you conceptualize where you need to get to, and then you need to figure out how to bring some of it to life. And as a path toward bringing all of it to life and bringing about change that is both transformational and sustainable. And I think that's what the politics of the moment calls for. And certainly, I think we've seen the Biden administration get off to a great start in that regard with the passage of the American Rescue Plan.
Thank you, brother. It's been an absolute pleasure. I got one for you. Somebody gave me this one the other day. A setback, nothing but a setup for a comeback. You might have heard that one too. So that one works with what you said. Hey, much appreciated that you've taken the time to be with us, to pour into us, faculty, staff, students. It's remarkable. I wish you all the best, and I look forward to our continued engagement. I look forward to see how we can help you continue to do the good work you do in Brooklyn.
Thank you so much, President Miguel, and it's great to be with you as always in the St. Francis family. As you mentioned, Wayne Williams, who sometimes goes by the name Boy Wonder, is a proud St. Francis graduate, senior policy advisor. When you see me in Washington, you see Wayne. He's always next to me, and certainly St. Francis served him well and is now serving the Congress and the caucus well. So keep up the great work, and look forward to seeing everybody soon.